After learning about Brazilian history in the 1850s and through the 1890s, it's not difficult to tell where a lot of the ideas in Dom Casmurro came from. Between religion, politics, the social structure, and the author's life, it's not hard to tell where a lot came from in the novel. First, starting with religion, Machado is obviously somewhat critical of religion, especially Catholicism. You can tell with his inspiration of Renan, who wrote an extremely dramatic rendition of the resurrection of Christ. Almost like, children's story as opposed to something that people base a lot off of, In the novel, we have a scene after Manduca's death where Bento is reflecting on his sort of saint-like behavior for writing to Manduca for 2 to 3 months. He's basically saying that, when it comes time to go to the afterlife, perhaps this virtuous act that he committed by writing to Manduca, this poor leper, perhaps that can relieve some of his sins because he has committed many. And then we see, right after that, he refers to Manduca expressing his opinion about Russia, and basically saying that that opinion, if it was a sin, could cost Manduca years in purgatory. Not necessarily saying it will, but if it was a sin, which he implies that it is, it will cost him years. Yet these 2 to 3 months of writing, which Bento himself ended and wouldn't even go to the funeral, will alleviate some of his sins. So it's interesting because how the caste system almost determines, in Bento's eyes, your afterlife even. You'd think of religion as something that unifies a group of people of all caste systems, but it doesn't. We have the rich boy who does a small virtuous act of literally just corresponding to somebody, and yet that will absolve his sins. And then we have a poor boy who expresses one opinion about something and turns out to be right, and it is a sin, possibly, and he could have 20 to 30 to 40 years in purgatory, according to Bento. And it's just Bento's narrative, but that is the narrative of a rich boy, so. Machado's view of religion is similar to Martin Luther, the inspirer of the Protestant Reformation, because he hated indulgences, which was where people could pay for their sins to be removed, which was basically the church's way of making money. And it's a lot similar to when Bento is, making a promise to God to say 1,000 Ave Marias and Hail Marys. If he gets his way, it's so similar, and I think that is what Machado found a lot of flaws in religion, which was the whole repayment after sinning. So that's obviously present when you hear Bento many times refer to that. And also his mother. I mean, it's interesting because Bento is actually living proof, in his mother's eyes, of a promise she made to God. So she owes it to God to send Bento to the seminary because Bento is literally living proof of a promise she made, which is also kind of a criticism from Machado, it seems, because not only is Bento arrogant and pretentious and makes all these promises to say 1,000 Hail Marys, but he is also actually living proof of someone else's promises, so that might affect his character in a way. The caste system in Brazil is somewhat prevalent in the book. Bento is of upper middle class, and his narrative is completely reflective of his stature, his social stature. You can tell how arrogant he is. You can tell how he sees himself better than everyone else. When he refers to the funeral and he says, the luster of his presence, right there, you can tell that he sees himself, not that he's just vain, but that going to this poor boy's funeral as a rich boy would just be, everyone would be in awe of him. I mean, everything surrounding Manduca seems to be a criticism of the caste structure in Brazil. Just his writing to Manduca, giving up on Manduca, imagining all the happiness that Manduca got from his letters because of maybe because of his social stature rather than Manduca having a friend. In regards to politics in Brazil, a lot of systems that ended up working really well were oligarchies, which were supported by patronages, so the rich people giving money to these smaller forms of government, which were predominantly higher class and rich people. It goes right back to the caste system. Just that there was such a distinction of class in Brazil, and there didn't seem to be as much distinction of race as there was of class. It didn't seem as important whether the slave was black and the master was Brazilian, Portuguese, white. It depended on whether the slave was poor and the master was rich, and of course the slave was poor if they were a slave, and so that was what distinguished them, not as much as race. We also see a country where church and state were not separated for a very long time, and that's why church is so important to all of these people. Mikado was not raised in the upper middle class like Bento was. His father was a pretty poor painter, and he got sick really young and had to rest in bed for a long amount of time, and that's when he picked up writing. So immediately we see a connection with Manduca, right there. I don't think it was very common for the son of a poor painter to write a novel from the perspective of a rich, upper-class, arrogant boy who goes off to the seminary and then leaves. So much of Dom Casmurro was influenced by Mikado's life, but also Brazil and the caste system, as well as politics, and especially religion. A lot of it came from religion, the power religious members had, the power rich people had, just power.